Welcome to ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesday. Today's segment is Issues and Insights, sponsored by Pacific Forum CSIS. And now your host, international business lawyer David Day.
Well, good afternoon. We are here, we are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467, and we're going to be talking about Australia Rising. And our special guests are Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum, and Ms. Nicole Forrester, formerly with Australia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now the Director of Pacific Forum's Young Leaders Program. So, Brad, let's check in with our audience so they can hear your golden pipes.
My golden tones. No, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for having us. And yeah, thanks.
And yes, you're right. It is not Tuesday. It is Thursday. Nicole.
Yes, David.
Great to have you here. And can you give us a little bit of that Australian accent just to kind of flavor the program a little bit?
I will try to stay honest to my roots and not let the American vernacular influence me at all.
Perfect.
David, I hope we can keep you focused and not just marveling at the dulcet tones and the rounded vowels. There's substance here. We have to focus. Focus, David.
We'll focus on that. Well, you know, one of the things that we, to get underway here, that perhaps some members of our audience haven't noticed is a very interesting or bitter political infighting that has taken place in Australia recently. And Nicole, what's the level of this? I mean, you've had a chance to watch some of the American political exchanges. I won't call them debates. I'll call them exchanges. And so, what is this rivalry or bitterness all about here?
Well, the Australian government's perception among the public has perhaps had a little bit of a legitimacy issue. So this goes back to 2010 when then current Deputy Prime Minister Julia Gillard challenged the sitting Prime Minister for the leadership of the party and therefore for the leadership of the country. And she basically overthrew the sitting Prime Minister through the leadership challenge to become the first Australian female Prime Minister. Then she went on to win an election. However, she didn't win the election with an absolute majority and there was a hung parliament.
Okay.
So to make government, she had to rely on the Australian Greens Party and 3 independents to guarantee supply. And I think that underpins where the current divisiveness in Australian politics sits, because the opposition party haven't bought into the legitimacy of the Gillard government.
Okay, and so does that kind of, you know, I saw an exchange that took place in the Australian Parliament in which she was addressing the leader of the opposition in some terms that, frankly, kind of shocked me. I mean, she was slapping this guy up and down both sides of the head.
Well,
I mean, it was brutal.
You could say bitch slap, but that would be somewhat
we wouldn't say that.
insistent, as well as far too provocative.
Yeah.
it's definitely not as polite as what I've seen most recently in the US debates. The Australian Parliament is a robust environment, and you
that's putting it charitably.
and you have to be able to roll with the punches and carry your own. And so I think she was perhaps being responsive to some previous comments that had been made outside of the parliamentary setting. And so it's characteristic of how difficult an environment it is at the moment in Australian politics.
Okay, so she's operating in it with a cobbled together coalition with a lot of nasty talk, desperate,
interests, yeah.
Okay.
And it's a tough environment, but interestingly enough, they've been able to pass through some very difficult legislation. So unlike the deadlock that we've seen in the US recently, the Australian Parliament has still been passing bills that have been contentious, and that's down to the support that she's been able to cobble together. One of probably the most contentious was the carbon tax. So climate change policy in Australia is one of these issues that is a little bit perplexing to people who look from the outside in. We have an industrial base that would not lend itself to the support of a carbon tax because it would affect our international competitiveness.
Okay, so for our listeners, the carbon tax is a tax on emissions from industry, basically.
Industry that produces carbon,
Okay.
either by its processes or by the nature of what the work that it does, for example, the coal mining.
Okay, so this is conceptually kind of a anti-global warming type
Yes.
action, and then it's in place, she got it through, it's done.
Yep, she got it through, it's done, it's in effect.
Except didn't she also promise she wouldn't pass it originally, which is part of the problem?
Yeah, exactly. So her government is built on partnerships based on promises. So originally she promised the Australian people that she wouldn't introduce a carbon tax, but when she didn't win government, when the Labor Party didn't win government outright and the hung parliament required Prime Minister Gillard to create these partnerships with the Greens and the Independents, they extracted from her promises with relation to moving forward the carbon tax.
Okay, so she's got a reneged on your promises type problem to deal with, in addition to all these other things.
Yes and no. And the no is because the Australian people care about doing their bit internationally, and in particular doing their bit internationally on the environment.
Okay.
So the 2007 election, which Kevin Rudd won against the sitting Prime Minister John Howard after an 11-year renewed terms, was one of the things that Kevin Rudd ran on was ratifying the Kyoto Protocol.
Okay.
So climate change policy action in Australia and internationally matters to Australian voters.
So even though she promised not to enact that legislation because of Australia's interest in doing its bit internationally, she pushed through the carbon tax and ratification of the Kyoto Protocol?
Kevin Rudd did the Kyoto Protocol. It was one of the first things that he did as Prime Minister. I think there's another element to that briefly mentioned, which is that the compensation package for Australian voters or the Australian public around carbon tax has been very generous. So offset against the broken promises, you're not going to be worse off.
Okay, well, what is the compensation package?
A raft of programs around, for example, giving taxpayers back cash if their electricity bill goes up, and many other aspects.
Okay, interesting. Well, this atmosphere of bitterness and infighting, one of the things that has occurred recently is that Australia has just been elected to or appointed to elected to a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And what's the connection between that and this bitter political infighting? I mean, it would. It's hard.
What's going on here, Nicole?
Yeah,
Straighten us out, Nicole.
There's several things going on there. If you look at the purely domestic level, the decision to run for the UN Security Council was taken by the Labor government. The previous Liberal government, which is now in opposition, did not have strong multilateral credentials. They weren't as engaged in the United Nations as previous Labor governments had been. So there is no bipartisan support, both sides of the aisle, for the UN Security Council bid that we just won. And it's become a little bit of a political football. So there's lots of stuff in the media around how much did it cost, what did we do to win, how are we going, we being Australia, how are we going to use this, what does it mean for Australia? And that's all playing out in the domestic bitterness in the political stuff.
Okay.
Then there's the international angle, which is where is Australia positioning itself? How does this fit into our broader foreign policy strategy?
Okay, and we'll get to that in a moment, all right? But, Brad, I wanted to ask you, what's the significance, maybe from a U.S. perspective, of having Australia serve on the UN Security Council?
It's great. It's wonderful. I mean, on a bunch of different levels. I mean, Australia is one of the 5 U.S. allies. It's a country with which we have a deep, long-standing, abiding relationship. Pick your, from an American perspective, you can't say enough, I think, good stuff about our Australian allies. I realize it's slightly more contentious within Australian politics, and Nicole, I'm sure, can speak to that. But, and while there is, I think, a large, more than 75% or 2/3, 3/4 majority in terms of acceptance of, commitment to the alliance, there is nevertheless you know, some division within local politics or national politics in Australia between, you know, unilateralism, if you will, or national versus the multilateral approach. And you know, we've seen echoes of that in the United States election. Is to what degree do we, for Australia's choice, is how close to the U.S. versus how close to other countries and other institutions. So, you know, for as an American, we look and we say, great, our partner, our ally is out there, in which we expect, you know, we don't expect them to walk in lockstep with us, but, you know, shared values, shared interests, shared concerns. We've been in lots of wars together, and so this is good. And I would also argue, more generally, for Australia. I mean, Australia is an important country in the world, regardless of its relationship to the United States. And so the idea that you have a country like Australia stepping up in a multilateral forum like the UN, the Security Council, is a good thing for the world. It's a good demonstration of what responsible leadership is, and on that sense alone, if you want to call it a second order effect, I think for the United States it's great. My feeling is, and I think, you know, from my perspective, as we look at U.S. foreign policy, the best thing that we do is we line up countries that think the way we do, to support the same values, support the same institutions, and whether or not they're close allies or whether they're independent, but if they're backing the same kind of order that we are, that's good. We want as many voices sending the same message, and that kind of, the larger that chorus, you know, I think the more powerful the message.
Very interesting. Very good. We'll talk more about Australia's identity crisis when we come back after the break.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
We are back, we are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. You're listening to KGU 760 AM, which is part of the Wall Street Business Network. And we are talking about Australia Rising. And our guests in the studio are Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum, and Nicole Forrester, formerly an Australian diplomat, who has seen the light and is now a director of Pacific Forum's Young Leaders Program, something like that.
That's it.
Should I not have said that?
No, absolutely. Okay. I'm very happy to be the director of the Young Leaders Program.
And ladies and gentlemen, you heard a little bit about Pacific Forum's Young Leaders Program during the commercial break there. But let's return to our discussion. At the break, we were talking a little bit about, or getting ready to talk about, what I call Australia's identity crisis. And you know, that's a bit unfair. But what we really want to get at is Australia's this whole notion of a middle power and where it sees itself in the Asia Pacific region. So maybe let's start. What is, Nicole? Help me with this. What is a middle power for our audience?
Well, it's not a great power.
Well, okay. All right, we're done. Thank you very much. That was.
It's a country that sits within a group of other countries that has no power to influence the world events of its own doing. So it has to use its relationships with other either middle powers or relationships with great powers to influence from the sidelines.
Okay. And so what is the kind of the tension that exists in Australia's identity with itself on where it fits in the Asia Pacific region? Is it an Asian country? Is it tied too closely to the U.S.? What is this tension all about?
I think that it's not so much a tension, but a continuation of a conversation that we've been having in Australia for a while now. So Australia sees itself as a part of Asia. Historically, Asia perhaps hasn't seen Australia as a part of it.
Why is that?
Well, perhaps, you know, historically Australia has been predominantly Anglo-Celtic in ethnicity, and some of the ways that we frame our thinking have been very much from the Western perspective.
Okay.
But I'd say that from the 1980s onwards, we've definitely started to take the idea of Asian literacy and started to embed that into the way that we think about ourselves. And so we are becoming more Asian, not only with our immigration and the population, but the way that we think about doing business.
We are becoming more Asian versus Asians becoming more Australian?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to check.
Although you can also make the case that given the proliferation of Australian graduates throughout the region, which is one of the most, I think, important contributions that Australia makes, that's not as facetious a comment as you might think, David, so apologize.
Well, you know, one of the other contributions that Australia has made throughout the region is in consultation with various governments in terms of new laws respecting governance and generally legal reform throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Australia has been a big player in contributing ideas.
In particular in intellectual property right protection. That's one of
That's
the
right.
areas that Australia really has worked very hard in the region on.
You see Australia, Brad, as maybe a kind of a possibly playing an anchor role among the middle powers of the region?
Oh, certainly, yes. The short answer is yes. But I mean, I think this question of Australia's role in the region and in the world is a really fascinating one. And Australia is, you know, the short answer, I think, to the question you might have asked to put my, admittedly, jaundiced spin on it, you know, it is essentially an Anglo-Celtic, Anglo-Saxon country that's geographically located in the midst of Asia. And whether it takes the, you know, if you will, the cultural, historical perspective on where it is and where, or it's literally the face of the nation is defining who it is. And the tensions between, you know, the choice was clearer or the choice was easier at a time when it was a Western transatlantic world. And those transatlantic roots, that Anglo-Saxon Celtic root, was easy to predominate. And now, as Asia rises, or re-rises, and as the world takes on a different cast, then suddenly the choices become a little more acute, and the splits and the pulls, if you will, within Australia become tougher. And you know, a key component of what Australia goes through is and how it defines itself. I mean, historically, until 1945, you know, it was the tie to the United Kingdom. And you know, and of course, the UK plays a diminishing role globally in the aftermath of World War II. The United States steps up and becomes the global leader. And so the question of Australia's first, you know, association and closest tie becomes that to Washington. And so that creates the biggest tension. And that is a tension, if you will, that's replicated, I think, throughout the region. And that is, you know, the easy way to put it is that, you know, Australia, historically, most countries have looked to the United States for both economic and security ties. And as China has reassumed its position in the global economy and in the regional economy, that China now it plays a huge role in the economies, both as a trading partner, as an investment partner, as a tourist partner. We in Hawaii know that as well. But at the same time, the security ties remain as they have been. And consequently, the question becomes, how does Canberra, just as Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, how do so many other countries in the region reconcile what seems to be, and seems is an important verb, the tension between those security relationships and those economic relationships? And some people would say, that's a false, you know, the dichotomy doesn't exist, and consequently you're making a big muck out of nothing. Whereas in fact, regardless of whether or how powerful these competing tensions are, they're nevertheless perceived to be real. And so the question that Australia raises in rarefied form, and is in some ways asking, there's an Australian academic by the name of Hugh White. He's not an academic, actually, he's a former defense official who's now in the academic and policy world, who's asking most quickly is, you know, is it a choice now between China and the US? And we need to anticipate, I think, some of these discussions. What's most important for us, in the United States in particular, and is we need to figure out what the questions are being asked and how we choose to address them, and merely dismissing them, as I hear so many people doing when we talk about these tensions.
I mean, this is the U.S. dismissing the questions that Australia is asking.
I hear Australians dismissing these questions as well. It's not the way it works. And it may be, but perceptions shape reality. And so what's important is that we look and take the question seriously and come up with good and convincing answers. And that's, I mean, in many ways, I think one of the most important things that Australia is doing right now is making so clear the tensions, the pulls, and you know, the questions that so many countries and governments face as they look at a changing world order.
And one of the ways that the Australians are developing this thinking is coming out very shortly, is it not, Nicole?
Yes, so Australia in the Asian Century White Paper is a culmination of about 18 months of stakeholder consultation and then thinking by Australian thought leaders, of which one was a former Australian Consul General to here in Hawaii, John Quinn. And we had an opportunity to speak with him when we were recently in Sydney for a Pacific Forum conference, which we took young leaders to, and he sought the next generation perspectives of the young leaders that we had there.
Let me make sure this is clear. So Rudd sought the advice and consultation of Pacific Forum's young leaders for this white paper. Is that what you're saying?
Not quite, no. I think
but you can misinterpret it that way, and we'll be happy with that.
You're drawing the bow a little too far, as we would say in Australia. But basically, that the young leaders had an opportunity to provide their input into this process, along with thousands of others of stakeholders within Australia and also within the region. And that culmination of those discussions and that thinking will come out next week in Australia, where the Prime Minister will deliver the white paper. And what that is a policy guidance piece, a think piece, which will help Australia define where it wants to position itself now, the next decade, maybe the next 2 decades, so that it is integrally a part of Asian prosperity going forward.
So is this white paper going to address kind of the tension that Brad was talking about?
I would be surprised if it doesn't mention the tension. However, this document is not a foreign policy white paper, it's not a foreign policy directive, and it was written by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet's office, not the Foreign Ministry office.
The prime author, in fact, is a former Secretary of the Treasury, right?
Yes, Ken Henry.
Why is Australia consumed with understanding its own identity in the region? I don't understand this. Maybe consumed is not a right word. Why are they focused on this?
I guess the Australian psyche is a very interesting beast. We're a country of mutts, in a way.
Mutts.
Mutts. I don't believe I just said that on international radio. But we have a cultural identity that is fused from many different places, and it has grown and changed and developed over the last 2 centuries since the British came to Australia, and it will continue to grow and develop as we see ourselves differently through the lenses of the people who come to Australia. So the largest, for example, the newest largest single source country for Australian immigration is India. So 500,000 Indians are now, Indian-born Indians are living in Australia. That changes the face of
a population of?
21.5 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
So is it fair for me to say that Australia is an ongoing focus or struggle with its own self-identity as a nation?
But be careful, David. I mean, it sounds like you're making this sound like some exceptional process. I mean, the United States is grappling with its relationship to Asia as well in this whole notion of rebalancing. And so I think what you're seeing is, I mean, for us in Hawaii, it's a given because we are a Pacific nation and we look around us every day. And I think Australians do as well, but it's a broader set of questions. But nevertheless, it's merely, I think, an attempt on the part of the government to say, how do we see the world evolving and how do we fit into it? And how do we make sure that we fit well and that we eliminate unnecessary points of tension as the world and as we change?
Sounds like a very worthwhile discussion to me. We'll have more when we come back. Stay with us.
We'll see how it goes.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
We are back, we are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 296, area code, 808-296-5467. I almost left the area code off there. And we're talking about Australia on top and rising almost here, and let's shift a little bit to talking about Australia's role here in the Pacific as an ally, which Brad, you talked about in the opening section of this program, historically a very, very close ally. And there have been some things that have occurred a little further back in the year, the announcement of the U.S. Marines in Darwin, and something I think very exciting has just happened with PACOM. And so why don't you fill us in with that, Nicole?
I imagine that you're referring to the appointment of a senior Australian Army officer as the U.S. Army Pacific Command Deputy Commander.
Yes.
Yes. He will wear an Australian uniform, but represent the US Army, both here in Honolulu, but also throughout the region. So where the US Army is meeting with partners, for example, in Japan, an Australian Army officer will be representing the US Army.
I mean, this is an incredible change for the way PACOM operates, to have a foreign military official representing the United States.
It does, and it speaks volumes of the nature of the relationship between Australia and the US. The Marines in Darwin are an integral part, I think, of the illustration of the Australian and US cooperation for the pivot, or the rebalance, as it's also known as. But it's officially known as. But it's only one aspect of that. And there are other things that are going to be happening in Australia in 2013, and in 2016 there may be a phase 3, which has not been announced yet. But I think the appointment of an Australian Army officer as the Deputy Commander at US ARPAC is really solidifying the relationship in a practical way.
Brad, what's your take on this from an American perspective of having an Australian senior military official representing the United States?
It's great. It's great. It's wonderful. You know, there's a lot of ways to look at this. I mean, take the long view. And Australia has been, as I said, a great ally. We've fought alongside each other for every major war the United States has fought since World War II, and including World War II, and before that, World War I. Australia has, and I think it speaks to the concordance of values. It speaks to the concordance of interests. It just, the fact that we and our Australian friends and allies see the world in similar ways, and consequently mobilize our forces. And I mean, and I use the word forces very broadly. And I think it's important, diplomatic, military, economic, to promote similar concerns. And that's what ultimately alliances are about. So that history is very, very important. The idea that we have, we've got liaisons from all of our major allies in all of our commands around the world. And so we've got, for those folks that don't know Hawaii, we've got consulates from the Philippines, from Japan, from Korea. Each of those consulates has military attaches. They are working very closely. They typically have one of their service liaisons. The Japanese have an Air Force officer that's at PAC Pacific Air Force, and so having these relationships are ongoing, and they're essential to having the communications, the operability, the understanding, the mutual understandings that what alliances are about. And so having an Australian general as the deputy commander, the combatant commander at G2, I believe it is, over at USERPAC, is just a sign of the importance that we attach to that, and of our partnership, and of the role that they can play. And in a world in which we are facing increasingly straitened fiscal resources, as we all know ad nauseum in Washington, and that you hear the same debate in Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra, that we need to be looking for efficiencies. And the task for the United States and its allies, particularly in the Pacific, is coming up with new balances of balances of responsibility in regard to our relationships with our allies and our partners. And this is one way in which we come up with ways to ensure that we are working most efficiently with these partners to accomplish our shared concerns and shared goals.
You see this as a potential precedent for other Asian military commanders to participate in PACOM, South Korea, Japan?
I would hope so. I would think so. There's one very obvious and easy threshold that works with Australia that's a little more problematic with others, I think, at least, and that's the language barrier. I mean, most of the time I understand my Australian friends. I think we speak the same language. But the language question obviously is a very important one. But I mean, you speak to soldiers and officers in the other services and our other allies, and their English is outstanding. Whether or not and for 99% of occasions, it's not a problem. You just have to be worried about that 1%. But I would hope that this is the leading edge of what is new relationships with the United States.
So this becomes kind of a model shift where the Pacific Command starts to look a little bit more like NATO, where you've got foreign military commanders. I mean, a little bit.
That's a long stretch, just because NATO is ultimately a multilateral issue. And this is really important insofar as it becomes the leading edge of an evolution of the United States military alliance structure and the if you will, the security architecture in the region, which is a fascinating topic and one we spend a lot of time working on. But you've got to be very careful about constitutional legal prohibitions, and the fact of the matter is that you don't have a genuinely security architecture in the region, and you know, unlike Europe, and that's changing, but slowly, and so that becomes something that really inhibits this broader evolution. But I think we'll get there over time.
Interesting. Now, Nicole, you had something you wanted to say here?
Oh, I was just thinking about what Brad was saying about efficiencies. I think, you know, not just placing senior military in each other's command buildings, but also the unprecedented intelligence and technology sharing and joint training that Australia and the US has, and has really increased our interoperability, which has had an effect on how effective we've been able to be in joint operation theatres like Afghanistan, for example. And probably even going one step further in the efficiency idea, which is that the alliance relationship that we have with the United States is not static. It's a document that has been in place for 60 years, but it continues to evolve. And a good example of that was the 2011 Declaration on Cybersecurity. So the willingness for Australia and the United States to continue to find new ways to be efficient, but also to increase our cooperation.
To keep going on this theme and to keep on this riff, which I think is an important one, I mean, one of the really, I think, most valuable elements of the U.S.-Australia relationship is the way that relationship acts, again, to use that word, as an anchor for broader multilateral efforts. So what you've seen over the last 5 or 7 years now is the creation of what we call the Trilateral Strategic Dialogue, which is the U.S., Japan, and Australia. And the Japanese, as you know, have very strict constitutional strictures that prohibit and security cooperation. But nevertheless, we've come up with a really, really robust dialogue on security, on diplomacy, and it's such that it becomes, I think, the beginning of a broader discussion of what's possible, not only between those three countries, but between, say, Tokyo and Australia as well. That, in turn, has goaded South Korea. And now you see both an Australia-South Korea defense relationship that is modeled in some ways on the Australia-Japan relationship. You have a call, perhaps, for a U.S., Australia, South Korea trilateral dialogue. And each of these triangles ultimately can expand, and you begin, again, to address this question of architectures. And to what degree do we start creating historically the model for for security in East Asia has been what we call hubs and spokes. The United States is the beginning, in the middle, and then you have each of its allies. Very little contact on the outside of the wheel.
So what you're really saying is that Australia becomes kind of a catalyst for these expanding multilateral relationships, as opposed to just the hub and spoke concept.
Absolutely, and that's, yes, without question. And one of the more interesting questions, which I think we need to be taking up as well, is the degree to which Australia, without the United States, if you will, but Australia acts as its own catalyst for multilateral diplomacy, economic strictures, et cetera, security as well within the region.
And beyond security, if you look at the middle power diplomacy that Australia has employed recently, Kevin Rudd, the previous Prime Minister, was at the centre of the G20 replacing the G8 as the go-to economic forum, and he was there at the beginning of the GFC, really pushing the interventions that kind of prevented the world economy completely going off the cliff. So it's not just where Australia can play a role in networking relationships across the region from a security perspective, but where those relationships have other dimensions. One thing that just popped into my head was thinking about with the US, where Australia can bring the US to the region in places where perhaps it hasn't had the same level of expertise as what Australia has, and Indonesia's a good example of that.
Or East Timor.
And East Timor. And so in Indonesia, Australia and the US are now working together on development issues. So we're doing some water and sanitation projects together.
And don't forget, just I think you should note, Australia was one of the founders and the intellectual founders of APEC.
Absolutely. Paul Keating was central to the creation of APEC and kind of slipping the idea to the Koreans.
Let's segue from this discussion into kind of the triangle that Australia finds herself in as between the United States and China.
You couldn't resist, could you?
I just couldn't resist that, and we might have to pick that up after the break.
I'd say what triangle, but okay.
All right. So where do you see Australia as fitting in that relationship, Nicole?
Well, perhaps
saved by the bell.
Saved by the bell.
Let me tell you all about that.
We'll pick that up after the break. Stay with us.
You're listening to Pacific Forum CSIS's Issues and Insights, part of ThinkTech Radio's Focus on Asia Tuesdays, with your host, international business lawyer David Day.
Australia Rising. We have in our studio with us Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum, and a former diplomat from Australia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
But we don't hold that against her.
No, we don't hold that against her. We're going to let it go this time as long as it doesn't become a habit. Ms. Nicole Forrester, who is the director now of Pacific. You're having to take a lot of heat from us, aren't you? Pacific,
it's okay.
Nicole is the director of a wonderful program at Pacific Forum called the Young Leaders Program. And we, right before the break, we were talking about Australia playing some kind of role in perhaps a triangular relationship as a middle power between the United States and China. And so help me with that, Nicole. I'm floundering around here. What is that all about?
Well, first of all, I would probably take a little bit of a note aside to say triangulation is really not where it's at. Let's think of it as more bringing everybody into the circle.
Okay. All right.
Some people, and Hugh White, an esteemed Australian academic, has really put this idea of a choice, perhaps, into the front of mind of the Australian public, and in part.
And the choice is?
Australia's future economic prosperity being linked solely to China.
Okay.
That's not what Hugh's saying, but that's the way somehow
it's
interpreted and presented sometimes in the Australian media, versus maintaining our strategic and security relationship with the United States, and that one has to suffer for the other. That's this idea of the choice.
Okay, and your view of that is?
Well, I'm not buying it, I guess is my view.
Brad, you buy it?
No, I agree with Nicole. It's just because, or she agrees with me.
All right.
Ultimately, I think that the way that it's been presented, it's a false choice, and that there is not a decision to be made, not now, and that Australians, the Australian government, the Australian people are ultimately realists, and we are going to follow our national interest. We have disagreed with the United States before, and we will do so again. And that's okay. The relationship is strong enough, mature enough, that we're able to do that. And likewise with China, we are starting to grow that maturity in our relationship, and perhaps issues that would have created very tense relations previously have not had the similar effect as that maturity grows in a relationship.
Is the Australian economy tied heavily to China?
Yes. So China is our #1 export destination, and that is skewed because of China's voracious appetite for commodities, and in particular coal and iron ore.
And if that demand shifts, then what?
Well, then the commodities boom ends, as it has previously. That we've had a commodities boom before, and it ended, and then we focused on other aspects of the economy. One of the sectors is services trade. Now, the United States and Australia, our relationship with the US is in Australian services, two-way trade, is the US is our #1 partner.
Okay.
So for some Australian commentators who say that the choice is between the US and China, I just don't think that that's a very nuanced or deep understanding of what's happening. So our second largest trading partner is Japan.
Okay.
So we really do have a focus in our economic security in Asia, but we also see that our economic security is tied to the US.
I mean, to follow up, and I think this is important, that these relationships are complex. The China choice, as Hugh White framed his argument, and I think you see throughout Asia, mistakenly, but nevertheless, in its sharpest form, is you have economic relationships with one country and security relations with another, and they create tensions internally. And the fact of the matter is that Australia's had 21 years of continuous economic growth, which takes us back by my math to 1990, which is before China's explosive, just before its explosive growth. So it's clearly not just China. And the United States, we live in an interdependent world. The U.S. is just as conflicted, if you will, with its relationship with China. And
Absolutely.
so, and as a lawyer, David, international lawyer, that you do business with China to export these raw materials, but at the end of the day, the final product and final demand is coming from Europe and the West, and that's why the concern about the ongoing problems in Europe are ultimately flattening demand, and so we're all integrated. And this notion of decoupling that we talked about a couple of years ago, no one's discussing anymore. So, and I think Nicole, I wanted to flag a word that she used a moment ago, and this is notion of inclusiveness, and I mean that's been, it seems to me, if you will, a felicitous byproduct of Australia's position in being, something of an outlier within Asia. It goes back to where we started this identity issue, that Australia has has pushed for an expansive, included, whether it's an Asia-Pacific community, whether it's APEC, what have you, such that it is part of this broader community. And that's been, I think, the byword of Australian diplomacy. And consequently, that's the approach that Australia pushes. And as an American, hey, I like that. That's good. I want to see an inclusive Asia as well, because that includes us. And I think that again, this speaks to the value of having an independent voice, of one that is aligned with the U.S., not because it's the deputy sheriff, as some people have once said, but because our values and our interests line up. And consequently, it's good when Australia is in the United Nations Security Council. It is good when Australian opinions are respected in either global forums, regional forums, or whatever, because there's a concordance here. It's a good thing for both of us, and it's, thank the stars, or this is the nature of genuine international, I think, comedy in international relations.
We're going to run out of time here in just a moment, and Nicole, I want to take this concept that Brad is underscored of inclusiveness, and just focus on one country, and that's Indonesia, because Indonesia has had very, very strong growth, leader in the ASEAN community, fourth largest population in the world, Muslim majority country.
And on our doorstep.
And on your doorstep.
Australia has really worked very hard in the last decade to improve its relationship with Indonesia, and I think that the Yudhoyono has allowed us to do that. He's opened the door to really create what is now a partnership. Australia provides more aid to Indonesia than any other country in the world. So it's not only the largest recipient of Australian aid from Australia, but Australia's its largest donor.
But Australia, has it helped the U.S. relationship with Indonesia?
Yes.
I think that bringing Indonesia to the table to talk with Australia in a partnership manner has ripple-on, flow-on effects to whatever the US is doing bilaterally with Indonesia. It provides an opportunity for a conversation that has Australia, US and Indonesia, not just the hub and spoke.
So this is a perfect example, Brad, of what you're talking about, of Australia playing more than a role of simply a deputy sheriff of the United States. And in its middle power role, they are actually playing some kind of a leadership role.
And in particular, with Indonesia, we have a history of that. So Australia was integral to Indonesia gaining its independence from the Dutch, and then on the other side of that, Australia was integral in East Timor gaining its independence from Indonesia. So it's not always beds of roses. But having said that, I think the relationship with Indonesia is a mature one, and it's one that we respect each other. And to take that piece one step further, then it's easier for Australia and Indonesia to work together in the region. And you've seen that perhaps with the way that Australia has talked about the Asia-Pacific community, which didn't go very well, but the idea itself, I think, was taken up in other...
We're almost out of time.
Right. But I mean, the question becomes, the United States has got to learn to have diplomatic partners and not surrogates or sock puppets. And I think, the value of the relationship that we have, the closeness, the intimacy, allows us to trust our partners to speak. We don't need to be in every room. We don't need to be at every table, we the Americans. And we can trust our partners and to do the job, if you will. And they don't have to be Americans, but they can still manage to create outcomes that we as Americans like in the world. And think, for example, about, back to Indonesia, the Boxing Day tsunami. Australia was one of the members of the Quad group. And it was a function of our cooperation as an ally and the diplomatic ties that we'd established that facilitated the communication, that allowed us to stand up the troops, to deliver the aid, to create the foundation for a broader multilateral effort. And then once that job was done, the initial, the obstacles were overcome and the momentum was created, then we stepped back into a larger multilateral initiative. And that's what these alliances are for, is that they give you the means to deal, hopefully to prevent problems from arising, but to deal with them when they do. And again, in a straitened environment where we cannot be everywhere all the time, we have to be able to trust our partners. And I think there are few that we work with as closely that trust as much as the Australians.
This has been a really interesting, fascinating discussion here. We're basically out of time here. Do you have one last little piece that you need to put in here, Nicole, before we sign off?
I can see that the Australian-US relationship will continue as strongly in the future as it has over the last 60 years, and that if there are tensions around shifting power balances in the region, that we'll be able to address them by having frank discussions.
And we're probably going to have to need, as the music swells, probably going to need more shows, because I think one of the things that becomes obvious is that for all of the depth and all of the strength, I don't think it's a relationship that Americans in particular think a lot about, and it's one that deserves more attention.
You're right, and we're out of time. Thank you, and have a safe drive home.